welcome to the show.
Hi,
Thanks
George.
for joining us. Let's start, if we may, today and then work back.
Sure.
The picture I saw this evening of very clear war crime, the massacre of civilians in Kharkiv, the video I saw just the other day of the execution. They took the video themselves. It wasn't a secret camera of the execution of Russian prisoners of war. These two things indicate that this war has gotten much, much uglier, isn't it?
Well, actually, it's been this way for 8 years. The world is just now starting to pay attention, perhaps. But you had massacres of civilians going back to 2014, 2015 that were reminiscent of, when the Nazis lined up the Jews in Babi Yar, just outside of Kiev, and murdered them. So this has been underway for quite a while, and in a way we can say, thankfully, it's getting some attention now. But underlying that attention is just a horrific event.
Yeah, of course, Babi Yar was carried out by the SS, who stood smoking, while the followers of Bandera carried out many of the murders. Perhaps
Correct.
1 million Jews were murdered.
Correct.
And they were murdered mainly by Ukrainians. The same Bandera whose banner is held aloft by a substantial section of the nationalist forces in Ukraine. Yet none of that seems yet to have permeated into Western consciousness. Why?
It is a reminder of the power of propaganda in the West and their refusal to accept facts. They have conveniently tried to erase every reference to the Azov battalion and to its connections with not only Nazi imagery, but the slogans and the rhetoric, what they profess to believe in. I was somewhat ignorant of this myself up until about 4 or 5 years ago when I watched a documentary. It was made by an English barrister, What Our Fathers Knew, where he took the son of Hans Frank, who was the Governor General of Poland back in the 1940s. Hans Frank set up the death camps in Poland. And then a guy named by the name of von Wachter. Von Wachter's father was the Gauleiter of Ukraine. And so these were now old men. They were well into their 70s when this was made. And they went back to Ukraine and came upon, and in this documentary, there were modern day Ukrainians marching around in Nazi uniforms celebrating the SS division, the Waffen SS division that had been formed by Ukrainians at the suggestion of von Wachter. And there was a very old man in that group, when he learned that this was von Wachter's son, comes up to him and embraces him and says, "Oh boy, we could sure use your dad back here again." So this notion that the Nazi elements were somehow relegated to the past is just a lie. It's very present. It's very real, and it should be opposed with all of our effort. And yet, Britain and the United States, who both had, tens of thousands of soldiers, killed in World War II at the hands of Nazis, are now basically embracing the Nazis.
Larry, not 10 miles from here where I'm sitting, there's a Ukrainian prisoner of war camp. Even I had to drive past it a few times before it dawned on me that here was literally concrete evidence that we took Ukrainian prisoners of war because they were fighting on the Nazi side. And now we are the allies of the people who were fighting against us for fascism, for Nazism. Does anybody in the CIA, anybody in the State Department, anybody in the American government ever reflect on the irony, at least, of that?
But it appears not. Just the abject ignorance of history in the United States, the failure to appreciate what really transpired at the end of World War II, I'm very cognizant of the fact that what became the CIA, growing out of the OSS, and then there was military intelligence, and then in 1947, the CIA was formed. They recruited Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie was the head of the SS, the Gestapo, in France, and was responsible for the deaths of men, women, children, tens of thousands. And yet we signed him up, protected him as an asset, used him, and on the justification that we were afraid of the Soviets, even though the Soviets had been our allies in World War II. And the fact of the matter is, without the work that the Soviets did in fighting the Germans, it's unlikely that the United States and the United Kingdom would have prevailed in the Second World War against Germany.
Now, Larry, according to the Ukrainian authorities, 80% of the people of Kiev have no water and no power. They've had no power intermittently for some time, but now no water and no power. The air superiority that you identified way back in a very important article in March, right. The air superiority is really beginning to tell. The destruction, systematic, of Ukrainian infrastructure is effectively reducing Ukraine to a non-functioning state. How much longer can that go on?
I don't think they can endure this more than another 4 weeks. Frankly, with winter setting in, it's very interesting that the missile campaign that Russia is conducting against the power distribution centers. They're not actually blowing up the power plants. They're not attacking the nuclear power plants or the thermal power. But what they are doing is attacking the distribution centers, the electric nodes throughout the country. And anyone who's ever visited Kiev will know that in Kiev, the vast majority of the population, they live in high rises. And in high rises, you've got to have electric motors to pump water to the upper floors. Gravity doesn't get it there. And on top of that, as the cold comes in with winter, and if there's any water in the pipes, those will freeze, burst, and then you've got additional destruction in that building. So they've really become uninhabitable. You can't use the toilet if you're above the second floor. And so people are going to be faced with the choice of having to live in primitive conditions. It would be worse than living on a farm with an outhouse, or finding refuge in some other city or country. And I think the latter will be what will happen. This is like a bombing campaign, except instead of destroying the buildings and forcing them putting them into a pile of rubble, Russia is destroying the buildings by cutting off the water, the electricity. In a way, it'll be a more humane way to bring an ending to this war.
Well, let's look at what an ending to this war might look like. But before that, let me ask you why, in all these circumstances, of which, by the way, the majority of our citizens in your country and mine are entirely oblivious. They're still being told that Ukraine is winning the war. But we both know that that's not true. And the perspicacious audience of this show knows that too. So in all those circumstances, why has Ukraine not come to the negotiating table?
Well, the big reason is that they came in March, and it was your own Boris Johnson who intervened, and I think at the behest or with the support of Joe Biden, to tell the Ukrainians, back off, don't do this. The West, really the fate of NATO and Western leadership is at fate, is at risk here. The outcome of this war, which I believe is already predetermined, just because of the realities on the ground, it's going to mean an end to the American dynasty, the American supremacy that it has enjoyed since the end of World War II, particularly since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. The United States has enjoyed being the biggest and baddest person on the block, the biggest state. That's come to an end now. What is going to emerge out of this is a genuine multipolar, or let's call it a bipolar world. But it will not be a world where the United States can any longer dominate and dictate the terms, and frankly invade other countries at will. We've seen too much death and destruction wrought at the hands of the United States, first in Iraq and Afghanistan. Always stated to the public for the noblest of reasons, but when you get right down to it, I think it's had more to do with keeping military industrial corporations going, and that the bottom line can be improved for the shareholders. It has had nothing to do with actually making the world a more peaceful, more prosperous place.
And so the war goes on without negotiation. The reinforced Russian forces, and I saw a report today about how the reinforcements are certainly now arriving in huge numbers in Donetsk. A reporter referred to the vast number of Russians now around. The Russians are coming all right. What are they going to do next? At the moment, they've stopped on the Dnipro, which in a negotiated settlement would have been quite a tidy division of the country. But if there's no agreement, the Russians must go on. Where are they going on to? What will they do next, do you think?
Well, they have several options before them. Let's remember that right now there's still a sizable contingent. I'm not sure of the exact number of Ukrainians that are east of the Dnieper River. It would be very easy for the Russians. I mean, actually, I've been sort of surprised. The Russians could have taken down every bridge across the Dnieper and cut those troops off. They've left it open, and they've left it open, I think, for a reason that they're hoping that perhaps there can be a negotiated settlement, or that these troops will surrender before they are killed. If they don't surrender, then Russia it will first finish dismantling the electrical grids throughout Ukraine and render the cities impossible to inhabit. The water, the resupply for those cities will be dead, and then that translates into diminishing the ability of the Ukrainian government to supply the forces that are in eastern Ukraine. With that, Russia would then have the possibility of launching an offensive in a couple of different directions, where they could actually encircle that entire military force, having completely cut off from supplies in the wintertime. And they would be very much in the same position that the Sixth Army of von Paulus was around Stalingrad, when the Russians broke through, surrounded his forces, and there was no way to rescue them then. And that completely destroyed that army, and it really marked the turning point in World War II. And I think there's actually a similar opportunity presented to Russian forces if they have sufficient numbers on the ground. But clearly, the numbers in terms of weapons that they can supply, artillery shells, personnel, that's on the side of the Russians. The Ukrainian soldiers are left having to fight on the ground with very few vehicles and tanks, and there's not an abundant supply waiting to replace them. Plus, the ability to rush those supplies to the front is very limited as well. There's no air cover for the Ukrainians. They can't rely upon combat aircraft to come in and bomb the Russian positions. So with the onset of winter, coupled with the supply shortages, coupled with the manpower shortages, I don't see how they survive the winter this way.
Might the Russians take the southern coastline? Might they take Odessa? Might they link up with Transnistria? Do you think that might be a potential ending to all this, leaving a rump Western Ukrainian state, rather like Kosovo, a NATO protectorate, with Poland beginning to dream again of recovering its territory in Western
Correct.
Ukraine, Lvov and so on. It could be that by next year, Ukraine is just another Kosovo.
Yeah, I think that's highly likely. Russia's going to deal with expelling completely the Ukrainian forces from the Donbass, from Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. Once that is done, so basically it will be cleared up to the Dnieper River. Then they will be in a position to move both over land and from sea against Odessa and then on to Transnistria. I think that is ultimately their plan. The Russian general staff hasn't called me up to say, hey, here's our plan. We're going to, clue you in. But looking at it, I think it's clear that Russia sees Odessa as still part of Russia, which it was. And I don't see them walking away from that. What's really interesting is the constant chorus of people in the United States and I think in the UK that are insisting that Vladimir Putin is in trouble. He's on his way out. Got rising opposition in Russia. They're going to throw him out. We're going to get regime change. And what's really going on is what I've picked up is there's frustration in Russia. They want Putin to be tougher and more aggressive against the Ukrainians. And I think when the history of this epic is written, Putin will be judged as a great man in history because of his moderation, because he could have done things in a very more violent, more destructive way, and he actually tried to be more constructive and positive.
I'm keeping you longer than we said we would, and that's because you're so interesting, Larry. Can I ask you just one more question?
Sure.
Which
You're very
is
generous.
born out of your counter-terrorism experience. There was a story in the last few days about some of these Ukrainian fascists planning terrorist activity in Italy. Thankfully, the plot was foiled and the Italian authorities presented the evidence. My fear is, with all these weapons, including weapons that can be put in the boot of a car, that Ukrainians will be coming to a shopping mall near us, an airport near us, a bank near us, with politically motivated terrorism and crime.
Sure.
Have you given that any thought? Have the U.S. Authorities given that any thought, do you think?
Yeah, I think on the part of the U.S. authorities, they've given no thought. I mean, this is one of the most ignorant, ill-educated teams of national security that the United States has ever had operating this time. I mean, it is incredibly dangerous. They're so incompetent. I remember that terrorism is always an act of weakness. It's not an act out of power and out of being in a superior position. So I think it is likely that because these weapons are so widely distributed now and available, that they will be used. And when terrorism crops up, it is used as an excuse by governments to crack down on opposition domestically, and to claim that people who are actually not engaged in such violence are in fact terrorists. I mean, we've seen that in the United States. The people who entered the U.S. Capitol on January 6th were immediately labeled as terrorists, as insurrectionists, even though the only violence that was carried out that day was carried out by the police. They killed at least 2 people. The protesters killed nobody, despite regime lies claiming the opposite.
Larry Johnson, it's been a pleasure, a privilege actually, to interview you this evening. Thanks for joining us.